Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. I want to welcome Dr. Jackie Torres as well, who will be our speaker for the day. Jackie, I think maybe you see a number of faces around the Zoom screen that you already know, and so it's a joy to have you here talking with us to tell us about your work and also maybe to reconnect with some old friends. So I'm Charlie Brannis. I'm the chair of the Department of Epidemiology. And I know this is jointly sponsored between Epidemiology and the Columbia Aging Center. And it's just a pleasure again to welcome Dr. Torres, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Biostatistics at the University of California, San Francisco. Her research focuses on policy, societal, and family drivers of health in mid and late life. And one particular core strand of her current research focuses on how policies and family dynamics intersect to influence health and long-term care outcomes for older adults. She has a K01 currently and R01 level funding from the National Institute on Aging at the NIH. And she also teaches a course on the epidemiology of aging at UCSF in San Francisco. Today, she'll be talking to us about the intergenerational influence of adult-child SCS on older patients' cognitive performance and other risk factors for dementia. Thanks very much, Dr. Torres. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Charlie, for the introduction, and thank you to you and also to Dean Freed and the Columbia Aging Center for the invitation to join today. So I'm going to start right in and tell you a little bit about why I think that the research that I'm going to share with you today is important. So as of 2017, an estimated 55 million people were living with dementia globally. This includes the most common form of dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, as well as other forms of related dementia. There are currently no effective pharmacological interventions to reverse or halt the course of cognitive decline or dementia onset. And so this means that population-level prevention efforts that target modifiable factors across the life course are really critical.
Hi, I'm sorry, Dr. We're having a little bit
of feedback. Okay. How about now?
It seems okay now.
Is that better? Okay, great. Sorry about that. Okay. So again, in the absence of effective pharmacological interventions, population-level prevention efforts across the life course are really critical for reducing dementia burden. Increased educational attainment is a particularly critical target for early dementia prevention. So this recent review article describes that low education, which they defined as having no formal education or primary education only in early life, is one of the most important modifiable contributors to dementia burden globally. Own education has said to be associated with advantages that extend into late life, in part because schooling takes place during critical early life periods of brain development, and increased education may be associated with changes in brain structure and function in early life, establishing lifelong cognitive abilities and reserve. There are myriad other mechanisms by which education may influence late life cognitive performance and dementia risk, including via impacts on mid and later life socioeconomic status. So while interventions to improve one's own educational attainment are undoubtedly critical, there may be additional opportunities to reduce dementia risk via population-level interventions that target family members, including by improving intergenerational educational attainment and related social conditions. The idea of intergenerational influences of socioeconomic status, including on health outcomes in general and cognitive outcomes in particular, is not new. In fact, life course epidemiology, guided by a life course perspective, has one of its core components a focus on intergenerational influences on health. One of the innovations of this perspective has been to say that maybe we understand that one's own life circumstances may influence health into old age, However, the context of one's parents' lives and even one's grandparents' lives also seem to have this long arm that extends to influence the late life health of the subsequent generation through mechanisms such as fetal programming or by shaping the circumstances of that next generation's childhood, which of course also have a long range of influence across an individual life course. But in most life course epidemiology and cognitive aging research in general, the intergenerational focus typically only goes in this downward direction, descending from one generation to the next, with very little consideration of how influences may also go in the reverse direction, such that the life circumstances of a subsequent generation reach back or upward to influence the social conditions and health outcomes of those in prior generations, of their parents or grandparents. This gap was underscored by the title of this somewhat recent review article by Drs. Deneve and Kawachi, which said somewhat plainly that spillovers from offspring to parents or children to parents are understudied in the field of social epidemiology in general, or the epidemiology of aging. There has been an acceleration in this research on the influences of adult-child socioeconomic status, in particular on parents' late life health in the last few years, largely driven by the social sciences and economists. Scholars have examined the association between adult-child education and parent mortality across global settings, and smaller subsets of this work have focused on other outcomes, such as parents' physical functioning and cognitive outcomes, which is the focus of much of my research. However, there are a number of important gaps in this work. For one, although scholars have theorized about the mechanisms underlying the associations between adult-child socioeconomic status, most often measured as adult-child education, and parents' late life outcomes, there has been little rigorous exploration of the plausibility of these mechanisms. In addition, much of this research has been observational. There have been a number of quasi-experimental exceptions that I'll speak to you about in a moment. But I want to unpack these latter 2 points a bit further. First, let's discuss mechanisms. Why exactly might adult-child socioeconomic status, including education, but other measures of SES, matter for parents' late life health in general and cognitive outcomes in particular? Clearly, many of the mechanisms that are most often mentioned as driving the associations between one's own education or even one's parents' education, including impacts during critical periods of early brain development, are not going to be at play here, because these influences of adult-child socioeconomic status are largely going to be happening in parents' mid and later life. However, scholars have proposed that adult-child socioeconomic status may influence older parents' health by a number of overlapping economic and non-economic mechanisms. I won't go through all of these today, and you may think of many more than I've listed here in the course of this talk. But just to highlight a couple here. For one, children with higher socioeconomic status may influence their parents' health via direct financial transfers or indirect financial transfers, such as paying for healthcare or other health promoting resources. This could have downstream impacts on physical well-being, but also psychosocial well-being for parents, for example, by helping to alleviate poverty or reducing financial strain for parents individually or within the household or the family. I would say that these interlocking financial as well as psychosocial mechanisms are the most often mentioned in the emerging literature on this topic. However, scholars have also proposed another set of health behavior related mechanisms by which adult-child socioeconomic status may influence older parents' outcomes. For example, adult children with more socioeconomic resources may have access to more information regarding the link between health behaviors and health outcomes that they may provide directly to parents, for example, by asking them or suggesting that they quit smoking or change their eating patterns, or indirectly by a health behavior role modeling. Direct and indirect financial transfers could also be used to pay for health promoting resources such as healthier foods. And these health behaviors, including smoking or physical activity, diet, and so forth, could have downstream impacts on parents' cognitive performance and decline, as well as a range of other outcomes. Now that I've mentioned a bit about the hypothetical mechanisms, I want to tell you why I think that quasi-experimental research on this topic of adult-child socioeconomic status and parents' late life health is absolutely critical given the strong potential for residual confounding bias in this work. That potential may be extremely obvious to you all, but I'll just underscore what I mean in any case. We already know via decades of rigorous research that the socioeconomic chances of one's children are strongly shaped by the socioeconomic status of their parents, in large part due to systems and structures that keep social stratification in place across generations, and particularly in the absence of strong social policies that enable intergenerational mobility. We also know from decades of research, including quasi-experimental research, that our outcome of interest, parents' late life cognitive performance outcomes, will be heavily influenced by their own life course socioeconomic status. So we could hope that all of the potential dimensions of parents' own socioeconomic status would be perfectly measured within the survey data that we typically use for this kind of research, but we know that there will always be really important dimensions that go unmeasured. These could be components of parents' educational quality or literacy, whether or not they were the recipient of intergenerational wealth transfers or aspects of their lifetime occupation that will be left with biased estimates due to residual confounding if we have unmeasured factors along all those dimensions. There have been 2 prior studies, both led by my colleague, Dr. Ming-Ming Ma, an economist, that have used a quasi-experimental approach to address this potential for confounding bias. These studies leveraged changes to compulsory schooling laws that would have impacted the adult children of current cohorts of older adults as quasi-experiments. So using population level data from China, Dr. Ma found that increased schooling among adult children was associated with a substantial increase in parents' verbal memory scores. And explored some mechanisms in contrast to a lot of other research, finding that increased schooling was also associated with reduced malnutrition and higher body mass index among older parents, consistent with this potential for adult child SES to alleviate poverty for older parents. Dr. Ma and colleagues used the same quasi-experimental approach, leveraging compulsory schooling laws applied to population-based data in Mexico, and found again that increased adult child schooling was associated with substantial increases in parents' verbal memory scores and verbal fluency scores, both measures of cognitive performance. And I'll talk a little bit more about just how big these estimates are a bit later on. One really critical question, though, is whether these findings extend cross-nationally. So while much of my current and ongoing research has been based in the US and Mexico, and that includes observational studies on the association between both adult-child SES and adult-child migration status on older parents' cognitive and other health outcomes, I'm increasingly also engaged in cross-national comparative research on this topic, and that's the focus of a pending R01 that I'll tell you about a little bit later. But as part of that cross-national comparative focus, I'll be building on these 2 prior foundational studies in the work I present to you today, which will be focused on the effect of increased adult-child schooling in older parents' cognitive performance and other dementia risk factors in Europe. So one of the reasons why this study and this focus on Europe stands to kind of make an important contribution to this emerging quasi-experimental research on adult-child's education and parents' cognitive outcomes is that the landscape of intergenerational financial transfers, co-residence, and social protections in late life is extremely different in Europe as compared to the settings of the 2 prior foundational studies. So for example, I show data here on intergenerational financial transfers. So in China and Mexico, financial transfers from adult children to parents are very common, as evidenced by data from large population-based studies in these countries, so that you can see data here from international partner studies, the China Health and Retirement Longitudinal Study and the Mexican Health and Aging Study, showing a very high prevalence of older parents saying that they receive direct money from their adult children. So it makes sense that in these settings, the socioeconomic status of adult children may really matter in a context where direct financial transfers are occurring more commonly, and that overall association seems a lot more plausible. And that's, one of the reasons why I've done a lot of other observational work, and particularly in the setting of Mexico, given this close link between adult-child SES and parents' own socioeconomic status. But in the European setting, financial transfers from adult children to parents are extremely uncommon. So you can see the prevalence is at a maximum 2.5% for older parents in Spain, which reported the highest prevalence of receiving child-to-parent financial transfers. So if you go back to the slide on potential mechanisms, if economic mechanisms are the primary driver of associations between adult-child SES and parents' cognitive outcomes or other health outcomes, then we might expect to see fully null associations in the European context. Direct financial transfers are simply not a plausible driver in this setting. So we could expect that associations in this context will be much weaker or even null. However, if we do find associations within the range of those reported for the two prior studies, then that could suggest that other non-financial, non-economic mechanisms are more compelling underlying mechanisms linking adult-child SES to parents' health and cognitive outcomes, or that the protective associations between increased adult-child schooling and parents' late life cognitive performance are more generalizable among those who actually benefit from changes to compulsory schooling, regardless of the setting. Another strength of the study that I'm presenting today is that in the European context, there have been many changes to compulsory schooling laws throughout the 20th century, even into the latter half of the 20th century, that did impact the children of current older cohorts. So here I map these changes to compulsory schooling laws by both country and year of implementation and show the variation in the impact of these compulsory schooling laws. For example, the olive green line shows that Denmark passed a change to its compulsory schooling levels in 1971, increasing from 7 to 9 years of mandatory schooling. The Netherlands, shown above in pink, passed a law in the same year that increased compulsory schooling from 8 to 9 years. So this cross-country and temporal variation, I think, helps strengthen identification, given that we're kind of pooling estimates across a lot of heterogeneous policies passed across a 3-decade time period. So we're a little less worried, as we would be with a single compulsory schooling law change in a single country setting, that there may be other factors happening alongside these compulsory schooling law changes that could be actually driving any estimates or any associations that we do see. The overall intuition with these compulsory schooling laws is that changes to these compulsory schooling laws are a somewhat sudden shock, but even if not so sudden, that there's nothing about the change, and specifically the timing of the change, that would have been influenced by parents or respondents, in this case, own early life socioeconomic circumstances or other circumstances, such as early life health, that could confound our association between adult-child education and parents' own cognitive performance outcomes. So ideally, we address confounding bias by drawing on this instrumental variable that should not be influenced by measured or unmeasured confounders. We, of course, need to draw on a number of assumptions for this approach, and so I'll be presenting on those a little bit later. But I first want to share more about the data and how we translate the information on changes to compulsory schooling laws into the actual instrumental variables that we use. So we use data from the Survey of Health, Aging, and Retirement in Europe, or SHARE, which is a cross-national study of older adults in Europe, whose baseline interviews were conducted between 2004 and 2005. This study, as with many similar population-based cohort studies of older adults, asks about both the demographic and socioeconomic status of respondents' children. We restricted our analytic sample to respondents with at least one living child, and the 9 countries that had compulsory schooling law changes passed in years such that they would have impacted the children of share respondents. These adult children would have been between about 35 to 55 years of age at the share baseline. We further restricted our sample to respondents whose oldest child was born in one of the 10 birth cohorts to have been first impacted by the change to the compulsory schooling law, or in one of the 10 birth cohorts to have just missed being impacted by this compulsory schooling law change. Restricting these birth cohort bounds is really common practice in studies that use compulsory schooling law changes as instrumental variables in Europe. There are so many laws passed around compulsory schooling and other social policies within the same time period all across the 20th century. So we want to ensure that we're not accidentally capturing the effects of earlier or later compulsory schooling law changes. So for example, I mentioned Denmark passed a compulsory schooling law change to increase mandatory schooling from 7 to 9 years in 1971. The first birth cohort to be impacted by this change, based on the average age at school entry and the previous minimum school leaving age, was born in 1957. So we consider those born between 1957 and 1966 as exposed to the compulsory schooling law change. And those whose oldest child was born between 1947 and 1956, so who just missed benefiting from that change, as unexposed. And so this indicator of having an exposed or unexposed child to that compulsory schooling law change will be our instrumental variable. We also use a continuous version of this instrumental variable that measures the distance between that respondent's oldest child's birth cohort and the cohort that would have been the first to be impacted by the change in compulsory schooling law. I won't go into detail on that, but you'll see that continuous measure come up occasionally in the results. So our primary interest was in evaluating parents' cognitive performance outcomes, given the orientation of this project and the pending R01 related to this project on dementia outcomes. We used 3 primary measures included in the share, one of immediate verbal recall, in which respondents were asked to repeat a list of 10 common words immediately after first hearing them, of delayed verbal recall, in which they were asked to repeat the same 10 words after about a 5-minute delay, and then a measure of verbal fluency, in which they were asked to name as many unique animals as they could within a 30-second time period. We transformed all of these measures into Z-scores and also created an overall cognitive performance score, which is just a weighted sum of the Z-scored cognitive performance tasks. We secondarily evaluated psychosocial and health behavior related outcomes in order to probe further at the potential for these outcomes to be underlying any relationship that we saw between adult-child education and parents' cognitive performance. So as I mentioned, very few studies have done this. In fact, only one other quasi-experimental study, the same study based in China led by Dr. Ma, has ever examined the association or the effect of increased adult-child schooling on depressive symptoms and life satisfaction. And that study also looked at continuous body mass index, but no other quasi-experimental study, to our knowledge, has evaluated the effect of increased adult-child schooling on a comprehensive set of parents' health behaviors. So very briefly, we measured psychosocial outcomes with a measure of subjective quality of life and a measure of continuous depressive symptoms. And then our health behavior measures included current smoking status, whether they were a current smoker or not, a measure of whether they were excessively drinking at the time of the survey, whether they reported physical inactivity, their continuous body mass index, and a binary indicator of obesity. So many of these factors are in their own right really important levers for population level dementia prevention, as indicated by the same review, which highlighted the importance of midlife and late life health behaviors for reducing global dementia burden. So onto our analysis. Our analysis follows conventional 2-stage least squares regression, in which we first regressed the years of schooling reported for each respondent's oldest child on the exposure to the compulsory schooling law captured by that binary variable indicating whether they were in the first 10 birth cohorts to benefit or whether they were in the 10 birth cohorts who just missed benefiting from the change. Along with, we control for a number of individual level covariates as well as spouse level demographic and SES characteristics for respondents who are married, as well as country fixed effects. And we also account for country specific time trends with an interaction term between country and respondents' birth year. Our second stage model regressed respondents' cognitive performance Z-scores on the predicted value of schooling for their oldest child, generated with the first stage regression and the same set of covariates as the first stage model. We also replicated the second stage model, switching the cognitive performance scores for each of the psychosocial and health behavior outcomes as a first step towards evaluating whether these were plausible mediators in this context. We also stratified models by respondent gender, given prior research suggesting that there may be differential returns to adult child schooling by parents' gender. And I actually forgot to mention in my slide on a couple of slides ago that we also looked specifically at differences when we switched the exposure to be years of schooling among oldest daughters and oldest sons, because there's also been some suggestion that there may be differences in either the association or the pathways underlying associations between adult child education and parents' outcomes based on whether it was increased schooling among their daughters versus their sons. There's a lot of mixed evidence there, but we looked both at differences by child gender and parent gender. So I want to just briefly flash all of the assumptions that we're making in the instrumental variables context in order to interpret our estimates as causal. So the first is the relevance assumption, and this assumption is that the change in compulsory schooling laws had an effect on the years of schooling completed by respondents' oldest child. That's what it would be in this setting. However, in the quasi-experimental setting, all that we can do is test whether there was an association between change in compulsory schooling laws and respondents' oldest child's years of schooling. We don't know whether that's a causal effect or not. But we took a step towards evaluating this assumption by estimating the association between oldest child's, oldest daughters, and oldest sons' years of schooling, conditional on exposure to the compulsory schooling law change, as well as the individual and spouse level covariates. So these are just the first stage regression coefficients corresponding to our two-stage least squares regression. We see, for example, that being born in one of the first 10 birth cohorts to be impacted by the compulsory schooling law change versus being born in the previous 10 birth cohorts to have just missed being impacted was associated with an increase of 0.6 years of schooling overall, or actually about 0.7, if you want to round up, years of schooling overall for oldest children among respondents and share. You can see that the association was stronger for oldest daughters, suggesting that there may have been stronger returns to increases in mandatory minimum schooling for daughters as opposed to sons who may have already been going beyond compulsory minimums. We also plot the discontinuity in the years of schooling for oldest children just for another look. This is across the 20 birth cohorts that comprise the unexposed and the exposed oldest children, and saw a jump in the years of schooling for those born in those birth years that would have made them eligible to benefit from increases in mandatory schooling across these different laws. We adopt the remaining assumptions for instrumental variables analysis, which I won't go into detail but are provided here with an interpretation specific to our study. Under these assumptions, the IV estimate is going to be interpretable as the effect of increased adult child education, specific to the oldest child, on parents' cognitive outcomes for families whose children increased their educational attainment because of the change in compulsory schooling laws, the people who complied with the compulsory schooling law change. This is also called the local average treatment effect or the complier average causal effect. And you can think of this as the intent to treat effect over compliance with the compulsory schooling law. So we also compare these estimates to those generated by a conventional OLS regression or linear probability models for binary outcomes So I'm going to go on to the results. So here are the results for measures of cognitive performance, and I compare results from the two-stage least squares regression, as I mentioned, using the binary instrumental variable and the continuous instrumental variable, which gives us a little more precision. I didn't tell you a lot about that, but mentioned it briefly, and compare those estimates to OLS estimates of the association between adult oldest child schooling and parents' cognitive performance scores without the instrumental variable. We see that the OLS estimates across the board suggest that adult child schooling is associated with better cognitive performance across the measures we focused on here. Immediate and delayed verbal recall and verbal fluency Z-scores, and the estimates are very precise. So the conclusion from OLS is there's just an association no matter what outcome we use. It looks small, it also looks really precise, and it's consistent across the board. The IV estimates, in contrast, suggest that only for verbal fluency Z-scores, each year of increased schooling among oldest children was associated with a 0.07 standard deviation increase in parents' verbal fluency Z-scores, although it was really only when we used this continuous IV that I mentioned briefly, which gave us a little bit more precision, and it indexed the continuous distance between the respondents' oldest child's birth cohort and the first birth cohort impacted by that compulsory schooling law change. The estimates for verbal recall scores appear fully null overall. Results were similar when we looked at oldest daughters or oldest sons' years of schooling as alternative exposure variables, with fully null associations for delayed verbal recall, and then some imprecise associations with verbal fluency Z-scores. I mentioned we also looked at differences by parent gender. Overall, across the board, confidence intervals were highly overlapping, so we can't conclude that there's true heterogeneity, and our estimates, of course, get less precise. However, in the case of delayed verbal recall scores, we found that associations were just completely null, completely crossing the null for women, but that there appeared to have been some modest returns to increased adult child schooling for delayed verbal memory scores for older fathers. Again, our estimates are imprecise and confidence intervals are overlapping, so we can't really conclude that there's true heterogeneity, but there appeared to be some stronger associations for fathers, or an association for fathers, I should say. We continue to see associations with verbal fluency scores, although again, we have less precision in these stratified models. Okay, so let's pause and place these estimates in context, because many of you outside of the field of cognitive aging may be wondering what to make of such tiny estimates. What does a 0.05 standard deviation increase in cognitive performance scores mean, and why does that matter? So just for reference, the largest point estimates we've presented so far suggest that each year of increased schooling among oldest adult children is associated with a 0.05 standard deviation increase in older fathers' delayed verbal recall Z-scores, although estimates are imprecise, and then about a 0.07 standard deviation increase in parents' verbal fluency Z-scores. To put this in context, the magnitude of the quasi-experimental association here is maybe on the order of half of what has been observed for quasi-experimental associations between each year of one's own educational attainment and late life cognitive scores. So about half of what we would expect for each year of own education and one's late life cognitive performance scores. So it seems our associations seem modest, but it also seems about right theoretically, as you would expect that your own education would likely be more impactful for your own cognitive performance than that of your children. Put in context of the prior studies on this topic, the magnitude of our estimated associations are much smaller than the very large quasi-experimental associations estimated in those two prior foundational studies that I mentioned towards the middle of the talk. So about half of the magnitude of what had been estimated previously. So why might there be those differences? I anticipated that we could see weaker to null associations in the European context, given what I told you about the contextual differences, a very low prevalence of intergeneration or child to parent financial transfers, a stronger state-sponsored social protections for older adults, although of course there's variation across countries, higher average educational attainment among older adults themselves, So these could combine to yield a weaker association between adult-child schooling and parents' outcomes if parents are not receiving direct financial resources from their adult children and have more state-sponsored social protections. It could also be the result of differences in the compulsory schooling laws themselves. So many of the compulsory schooling law changes evaluated in this study only changed compulsory schooling by 1 or 2 years, whereas the studies based in China and Mexico were focused on compulsory schooling laws that increased mandatory schooling from 6 to 9 years, so a much bigger jump. However, there's another potential driver of these differences, and that may be the selection of the index child. So we are kind of needing to select an index child or index children in instrumental variables research on this topic. I chose to focus on the oldest child, but the 2 prior studies focused on the highest educated child in the family. So when I instead switched the index child in these analyses to be the highest educated child, I found that estimates were in many cases of much larger magnitude when I focused on just that oldest educated child. For example, the estimates for older fathers for delayed verbal recall scores jumped to an increase of 0.11 standard deviations. And the estimates for the point estimate for verbal fluency, z-scores also jumps to be very large and on the order of the magnitude that we would find for own education, and also much closer to the estimates that were reported for those prior studies. So of course, the confidence intervals are overlapping throughout, but it still is meaningful that these point estimates are on the order of what we would expect to see for one's own education. And it could be that it's because this association truly is so powerful. It also, I think, the reason why we see these slightly inflated or much inflated point estimates when we switch to the highest educated child versus the oldest child is because of how the local average treatment effect is measured. So as I mentioned, it is calculated as the intent to treat effect over compliance with the treatment, in this case, the compulsory schooling law. So as compliance, or the percentage of compliers, goes down, the size of that local average treatment effect go up. And I would expect that children in any given family with the propensity to be the highest educated could have already been achieving higher than minimum schooling prior to these CSL changes. So they would have maybe been more likely to be what are referred to as always takers in this literature, so which are a type of non-complier who always receive the treatment, who are always getting higher than average schooling, regardless of what the compulsory schooling laws state. And so I would expect that percentage of non-compliers, of always takers, and that highest educated group in any given family. And indeed, when we look at this with our first stage estimates, we see that the magnitude of the coefficient is roughly half of what we saw when we focused on the oldest child as the index. And so this could be one reason why those point estimates, when we focus on the highest educated child, are nearly or actually exactly the size of what we would expect for adult child, for own education. So just to summarize thus far, we have found that quasi-experimental evidence of association between years of adult child schooling and older parents' verbal fluency scores overall. Estimates were, the lower bound of the 95% confidence interval overlapped with the null in many cases. Imprecision is a common trade-off with instrumental variables analysis. And we also found imprecise associations with delayed verbal memory scores for older fathers. So it's kind of a mixed and modest set of associations, I would say. Our largest estimates in our primary analyses were roughly half of what we might expect for own years of schooling. And our estimates were of smaller magnitude and less consistent than reported in prior studies in other settings. But it wasn't clear whether these were due to contextual differences in the compulsory schooling laws themselves, or potentially driven by differences in the and measurement, and specifically the choice of the index child, and something to do with the fact that highest educated children could be more likely to be non-compliers and therefore inflate the local average treatment effect estimates. So that's what I have for cognitive performance scores. As I mentioned earlier, another gap in this literature is limited, rigorous, quasi-experimental research evaluating psychosocial and health behavior related mechanisms. So when we switched to look at psychosocial outcomes and health behavior outcomes to see if those could be plausible drivers of the association between increased adult child schooling and parents' cognitive performance outcomes, we found consistent evidence that increased adult child schooling was associated with improved subjective quality of life scores for older parents. Associations with depressive symptoms were in the hypothesized direction, but were not as consistent as the quality of life outcome across the different instruments we tried and across some of the different sensitivity analyses. So somewhat of a mixed bag, but we did find more robust associations between adult child schooling or increased adult child schooling and parents' quality of life, and to some extent depressive symptoms. With health behaviors and related outcomes, things got a little bit more interesting. And while with psychosocial outcomes and even with cognitive outcomes, we didn't see much variation by parent gender with just limited exceptions. We did see some really interesting differences by parent gender when we looked at the association between increased adult child schooling and parents' health behaviors and related outcomes. So let's walk through these outcomes briefly. So each year increase in adult child schooling was associated with a decreased risk of current smoking among older parents. The association appeared to be really driven by returns to older mothers with completely null associations for older fathers. The inverse was true when we looked at physical inactivity, where we found that, again, an overall protective association between increased adult child schooling and the risk of inactivity, physical inactivity in late life among older parents. But in this case, the return seemed to be concentrated among older fathers with null associations for older mothers. With excessive drinking outcomes, we found overall null associations, but that increased schooling among oldest children was associated with an increased risk of excessive drinking among older fathers, a substantially increased risk, but a lower risk of excessive drinking among older mothers. So we found differences in the magnitude of association between increased adult child schooling and both smoking and physical inactivity by parent gender, with overall protective associations, however, and then differences in the direction of the association for excessive drinking among older parents. Finally, across the board, we saw associations with a lower risk of obesity and continuous body mass index for older parents, with no differences by parent gender. So just to summarize, we found mixed and somewhat modest quasi-experimental evidence of association between years of adult child schooling and older parents' cognitive performance scores. We found more evidence of association with psychosocial outcomes, including really robust associations with older parents' subjective quality of life, and then some select evidence of protective associations with depressive symptoms. I think we found the most compelling evidence that increased adult child schooling was associated with improved parental health behaviors overall, but we found some really important differences by parental gender, both in terms of the magnitude of associations and in the case of excessive drinking, in terms of the direction of estimated associations with that unexpected adverse quasi-experimental association between adult child schooling and older fathers' excessive drinking. So I want to just underscore the major contributions of this study and then lay out a few implications and next steps, and then I'll end. So this study draws on multiple compulsory schooling laws passed across 3 decades to evaluate associations between adult child schooling and any outcome for older parents. And this really builds on the really foundational prior single country studies by pooling estimates across really heterogeneous compulsory schooling laws passed at different time points. This is the first quasi-experimental study in this line of research on adult child schooling and parents' cognitive, psychosocial, or health behavior outcomes in a setting where child-to-parent financial transfers are uncommon and old age social protections are comparatively stronger. And I think we find that there are substantial associations, particularly for psychosocial outcomes and health behaviors, and to a lesser extent, older parents' cognitive performance outcomes, despite this low prevalence of child-to-parent financial transfers and other contextual differences. This is the first study, to our knowledge, that uses a quasi-experimental approach to comprehensively evaluate the association between increased adult-child schooling and parents' health behaviors and their related outcomes, such as obesity. So what are the broader implications of these findings? I think, for one, these findings, along with the other foundational research on this topic, suggest that points of social policy-driven efforts to improve modifiable dementia risk factors may not be limited to one's own life course. There may be intergenerational points of intervention. Of course, the life course perspective has already told us this for many decades, but this scholarship has largely gone in one downward direction, and our findings suggest that we should be looking at upward intergenerational influences as well. Second, these upward intergenerational influences are, of course, in addition to effects that such policies might have on their primary targets. For example, there's lots of other research suggesting that these same compulsory schooling laws had a positive influence on the cognitive performance, body mass index, mortality, and other health outcomes for those who were directly impacted by them, directly benefited from them. So if we only measure the impacts of these kinds of social policies in terms of the outcomes that they have on their primary targets, and don't consider both downstream as well as upstream intergenerational influences, we could be underestimating the total effect of these social policies on reducing dementia burden or improving modifiable dementia risk factors. And last, I think the implications here are that we really need to take seriously the potential impacts of adult-child SES on parents' health behaviors, and think and study more about the kind of really detailed mechanisms and pathways by which that association may come about, and explore further these differences by parent gender that we uncovered in this study. So I am working on a number of extensions to this research, including looking at cognitive decline, which is a more important metric of brain aging, actually, and outcomes for older adults with dementia, with a pending R01 that I'm waiting on and will hope to be funded soon through the National Institute on Aging. I won't have time to go over the aims here, but I'm really excited, particularly relevant to this talk today, on testing cross and within country heterogeneity by expanding this set of associations to on a global scale. My colleagues and I have also continue to make a lot of contributions on how adult-child migration experiences as another experience and circumstance that is directly influenced by policy, by restrictive historical and contemporary immigration policies in the US, has upstream influences on older parents' late life health. And then continue to do observational research on the contributions of adult-child socioeconomic status on parents' late life health outcomes, along with my PhD students. And I'm continuing to do other work on other social policies, as well as the impacts of adverse social and economic shocks that have primary effects on young and middle-aged adults, but potential secondary impacts on older parents. And that includes current work on the spillover effects of adult-child unemployment using variation in age, gender, and country level unemployment rates surrounding the Great Recession as an instrumental variable. I want to acknowledge my co-authors on this set of papers, as well as the R01, the pending R01, and other research that I've done on the upward intergenerational influences of adult-child circumstances on their older parents. I want to thank you for your time and the invitation, and answer any questions that I can.
Thanks, Jackie, for just a fabulous talk. That was great. I want to encourage everyone to ask questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself And if you remember to tell us who you are and from where you're joining us, from what institution you're joining us. But the floor is open. We have about 10 minutes for questions.
Sure, I can just go ahead. I'll answer them as they come in unless there's too many. So I see this message. Is it okay for me to jump in?
Yes, that would be fine,
Oh,
Dr.
okay,
Please do.
great. So I see a yeah, so I see a question from Dr. Minhee Kim. Thank you so much. Oh, postdoc at UCSF. Thank you, Dr. Kim. So in terms of the individual level confounders, we controlled for parents or respondents' own level of education. We actually had a couple of metrics of their parents' SES, which were measured by their parents' occupational prestige. That was the only kind of prior generation metric of SES we had. We also accounted for whether respondents had ever worked and what the occupational prestige of their primary lifetime occupation was if they had worked. And then we can also accounted for if they were married, their spouse's level of education, and then their spouse's occupational prestige as a kind of indicator of midlife socioeconomic status. We did not control for their income or their other more contemporary measures of socioeconomic status. Because we thought those could be mediators of the association. Oh. Okay.
And you have a number coming as you, I think you're reading the chat right now.
Yeah, I am reading the chat, sorry.
Okay.
Okay. Seth, Dr. Prince, do you want to ask your question? And then I can kind of parse through the.
Sure, I don't, but if you wanted to go through the other ones first that popped up, I don't want to cut the line.
Yeah.
All right, so sure. So I guess thanks for such an interesting talk. One thing that sort of struck me, I was just wondering sort of if you could describe what your theory of socioeconomic status is, for like what causes socioeconomic status, and for example, how is educational attainment like theoretically, conceptually part of socioeconomic status, and for example, how is educational attainment theoretically related to financial transfers, for example? So like how do you understand those
Yeah.
kind of big constructs?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think here I'm thinking about education probably in a couple of different ways. So one, influenced by the cognitive aging literature, in which we kind of think about the importance of education in and of itself as a metric of late life cognitive reserve because of when it happens in the timing of the life course, like during a period of critical brain development and kind of establishing, establishing late life cognitive abilities and reserve. But I think in terms of the children, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about education as probably the most upstream metric of socioeconomic status that may have a kind of cascading effect on downstream occupational opportunities, on downstream income, wealth, and so forth. That may enable the transfer of direct financial or indirect financial resources to their parents. Now, one topic that I could talk about for probably many hours and think about with my PhD students in the context of the US, but needs to be thought about elsewhere, is that the returns to education are not going to be equal, right, for within groups or across population groups, right? So we know that, for example, the structures in the US of systemic racism shape the way that education has differential returns to wealth, occupation, income, student loan debt, and so forth. So I don't think that, I think I've kind of laid it out here in a simplistic kind of, this is happening for the entire population, that, higher education has this kind of linear effect on, one's occupational outcomes and one's income and so forth, but know that there's a lot going on under there. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know.
That's great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So Dean Hart or Dr. Hart, I confess I don't know the associations that had the greatest p-value, but I know that the associations with health behaviors and quality of life are the ones that are kind of the most robust to whatever I threw at the analysis. We've continued to add lots more bells and whistles and clustering and more controls as we've gone through review for this work. And so I would say those are the ones that are consistently, robust to everything that we're throwing at these analyses. And Dean Fried, thank you for the question. I think, it's kind of interesting because I think the associations that we found with cognitive performance outcomes were much more modest than what we found for health behavior and psychosocial outcomes. So, I'm actually, it kind of, I think a little bit runs counter to my interest in focusing on those psychosocial and health behavior outcomes as mechanisms of the association between adult-child SES and parents' cognitive performance. Those may be the, those were kind of the most modest associations we found. So I still think that there's a number of mechanisms that may need to be explored further. And so one of those is about direct social engagement and contact. So, one of the mechanisms that's been proposed, but really has had limited empirical evidence on, is whether increased adult-child socioeconomic status leads to more contact or more co-residence or more just broader social engagement with parents. You could see how that could possibly go in a couple of different directions. But given the importance of social isolation on the one hand and social engagement on the other hand for late life cognitive performance and memory, I think that those may be some potential mechanisms by which adult-child SES may be influencing older parents' cognitive performance that we haven't considered. And actually looking more formally at mechanisms is a main, one of the main aims of the pending R01. But yes, to Dr. Factor Litvak's point, yes, life satisfaction could be one of those potential mediators, and actually, health behaviors as well, right? So we know that things like smoking and physical inactivity and so forth are all contributors to late life cognitive performance. Yeah, so there's a lot more work to do there, and that's hopefully what we'll be working on as part of this R01 in terms of mechanisms. Yeah, so, okay, I think we're at the end, but I see Dr. Belsky's question, and
You could take a couple more minutes, I think,
okay.
for those who are willing to stay.
Yeah, I think that this is a great question in terms of what might be more sensitive. I think it's one of the challenges, though, and kind of saying, okay, let's do a direct comparison across all these measures, is that, you really have a trade-off with this quasi-experimental approach in terms of precision, right? So we're kind of maximizing our internal validity, but we're losing a lot of precision as compared to what you saw with those OLS estimates that were nevertheless biased by unmeasured confounding. So it's a little bit hard to discern whether, for example, in the outcomes that I shared with you today, we're seeing a lot more modest associations with cognitive performance simply as a function of lower variability on those outcomes, or something to do with measurement, as opposed to, there just is less of a relationship there than there is with other outcomes. I think the current theory would suggest that anything that is sensitive to psychosocial well-being, anything that is an outcome of depression or other psychosocial factors in late life, will be the most sensitive to these outcomes, and anything that's going to be the most, that is also going to be directly influenced by financial resources in late life. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's kind of hard to conclude anything from what we have today, but I think it's a really interesting question. Oh, thank you for the question, Dr. Wong. So we did try to stratify analyses by country, and we just simply did not have enough power in each specific country. For the pending R01, we do have some hypotheses that we'll be testing about, even within Europe, whether there are countries, that have stronger old age social protections, where these associations could actually be stronger or could be weaker, right? So it could be, I mean, I kind of hinted at that in this course of this talk, but it could be that there are some countries within Europe that simply have stronger social protections that are not necessarily means tested, where, older parents may rely less on their children for financial well-being or so, and other economic resources. So I was really excited to do that, but I think that it's probably going to have to be limited to observational research to test these across country differences in share. And then our best attempt at kind of other cross-country analyses is going to have to harmonize and pool estimates across all of these different settings. But yeah, unfortunately, we just didn't have enough power.
And Dr. Torres, there's one more, I guess, related question, and then we're going to wrap up. Perhaps you answered that already.
Yeah. So, of course. So thanks for that, Dr. Spillover. So we can only evaluate this with contextual knowledge. This is, and so, I have in the appendix of the paper, for example, an entire breakdown of like, okay, here's when this compulsory schooling law happened. Netherlands also passed a compulsory schooling law some years before. And so, but our birth cohort bounds are set up such that people should not have been exposed to more than one compulsory schooling law. Greece had compulsory schooling laws that actually decreased the level of education prior to passing the one that I included in this study. So yeah, so that's and the birth cohort bounds are really important for limiting the potential for people being exposed to multiple compulsory schooling laws. But yeah, I'm happy to share more offline.
Thanks so much, Dr. Torres. That was fantastic. It was really great to see your work, to see the methods you used and how you applied those. I think it was pretty instructional for a lot of us. So we're going to close the session. Thanks everyone for taking the time to attend. And I suppose if there are any trailing questions, perhaps people can reach out to you to learn more about the work.
Yeah, thank you so much for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and was really excited to present this work with you all today.
Be well.